What if I told you that the US, the country that prints the world's most powerful currency, doesn't even have Bitcoin in its national reserve? Oh, and by the way, it's not even close to being a joke. It's more like a financial plot twist waiting to happen. Stick with me here. You see, the world has changed a lot since the good old days when money was backed by gold. And I'm not talking about the days when you would find your grandpa wearing gold chains like a rapper from the 80s. I mean real, heavy gold, the kind that was locked up in vaults to stabilize economies. Fast forward to today, and the world's superpowers are trading paper currencies with not much more backing them than faith in the institutions that print them. Enter Bitcoin, the new digital gold that's quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, making the case that it's more than just a cryptocurrency. It's a global reserve asset in the making. But the real kicker is that despite Bitcoin's rise to fame, the US government still doesn't seem to take it seriously enough to put it in their national reserves. Now, the question we should be asking is this: why? And more importantly, what happens if that changes? What if the US government decided tomorrow that Bitcoin is actually a legitimate asset, on par with oil, gold, or the US dollar itself? Before you dismiss this as another conspiracy theory or a clickbait headline, hear me out. Hi, I'm Simplified, and you're tuned into one of the most sarcastic, witty, and yes, occasionally thought-provoking channels on the internet. Where else can you get your daily dose of biting humor mixed with financial analysis that's probably just smart enough to make you question everything you thought you knew? It's called Nong because we're hot on this stuff. And we're all about diving deep into those world-changing topics you won't see in your typical mainstream media segments. You might laugh, you might scoff, you might even throw your phone at the screen. Don't do that. But one thing's for sure, you'll think. All of our info comes from multiple sources, some reliable, some questionable. But hey, if I've got something wrong, feel free to drop a comment below and correct me. I'm here to learn with you. All right, enough self-promotion. Back to the real topic at hand. Bitcoin and why it should absolutely not be ignored by the US government, especially when it comes to the idea of building national reserves around it. Let's rewind the clock a little bit. Once upon a time, way back before you were born, before your grandma was born, and before your great-great-grandparents knew what the heck a cryptocurrency was, the global financial system was directly tied to physical assets like gold. The gold standard was the rule, and if you had a ton of gold, you basically had power. After World War II, the US essentially became the king of the hill, wielding the mighty US dollar as the dominant currency, backed by gold. It worked until it didn't. Fast forward to 1971, when Richard Nixon made the bold move of decoupling the dollar from gold. And just like that, the whole backed by gold thing was over. The global financial system transitioned into a fiat-based system, which meant money wasn't backed by anything real. It was just paper. The value was in the trust people had in the government that issued it. And that trust has held up for the most part. But like all things that rely on faith, it has its flaws. Enter Bitcoin. Bitcoin isn't just some trend that will fade like your cousin's weird obsession with fidget spinners. This digital currency is here to stay. And more importantly, it's here to change the very nature of money itself. Bitcoin, with its hard-coded 21 million cap, is what economists call a deflationary asset. Unlike the US dollar, which the Federal Reserve can print at will, and let's face it, they will print it when things get rough, Bitcoin's supply is fixed. That's it. No printing press, no quantitative easing to inflate the money supply. This makes Bitcoin different from any other asset that's been historically used as a store of value. It's also decentralized. No single government, central bank, or billionaire, looking at you, Elon, controls it. It operates on a blockchain, which makes transactions transparent, verifiable, and irreversible. It's not perfect, but compared to the current system, it's pretty close. So why hasn't the US government adopted Bitcoin as part of its strategic reserves? The simple answer is that they're scared. Yes, scared. And who can blame them? Bitcoin represents a system that they can't control, a decentralized network that makes it impossible for governments to print more of it. But that doesn't mean the US can just ignore it. In fact, they're already starting to take notice. Let's be real. The US is not known for being late to the game, especially when it comes to financial matters. They're the ones who have held the world's reserve currency position for decades. The US dollar is the undisputed heavyweight champion of currencies. But here's the catch. What happens when the world starts losing faith in the dollar? What happens when inflation continues to rise and governments can't keep printing money fast enough to keep up with the demand? I'll tell you what happens. People start looking for alternatives. And right now, that alternative is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is seen by millions around the world as a hedge against inflation, a store of value, and most importantly, as a safe haven asset during times of financial instability. If you look at the historical performance of Bitcoin, you'll notice a pretty interesting pattern. While traditional markets crash during economic turmoil, Bitcoin has often surged. It's not a fluke. It's a sign that people are starting to see the value in Bitcoin as a financial asset that isn't subject to the same risks as traditional assets. Now, I know what you're thinking, but long Bitcoin is volatile. It goes up and down like a roller coaster. And yeah, you're right. Bitcoin isn't exactly your safe, grandma-approved bond investment. But volatility can actually be a sign of market maturation. The more Bitcoin is adopted, the less volatile it will become. If you look at the early days of the stock market, it was wild too. But once the system found its footing, it stabilized. Bitcoin will do the same. So, here's the big question. Should the US government officially recognize Bitcoin as a strategic asset and start adding it to their national reserves? Let's break this down. The US already holds strategic reserves in oil, gold, and foreign currency. But what happens when the next financial crisis hits and the dollar is no longer seen as the safe haven asset? The US needs to start thinking about diversifying their reserves into something that doesn't rely on faith in governments or institutions. That something might just be Bitcoin. Let's take this conversation a step further. Imagine for a second that the US government did recognize Bitcoin as a strategic asset. What would that mean for the global financial system? Well, it would mean a lot. And I'm not just talking about the price of Bitcoin skyrocketing, although that's definitely part of the story. First off, you've got to consider how this would impact the world's reserve currency status. Right now, the US dollar reigns supreme. Every time you fill up your car with gas, you're using dollars. Every time you buy something from overseas, you're probably using dollars. The dollar has been the cornerstone of the global economy for decades. But if Bitcoin were recognized as a legitimate store of value, even on a government level, it would fundamentally change that. Bitcoin would no longer be seen as some risky asset, but rather a core asset that's incorporated into financial strategies around the globe. If the US starts buying up Bitcoin, what's to stop China, Europe, or even Russia from doing the same? The race for Bitcoin reserves could soon turn into the new gold rush, and this time, it's all about the blockchain. Now, I know the Bitcoin haters are shaking their heads right now, probably calling me a dreamer or worse, a crypto bro. But hold on a second. We all know the US isn't exactly known for making moves based on idealism. They make moves based on power. And if Bitcoin starts becoming a real contender for global reserve status, then the US would have no choice but to take it seriously. But what does this mean for the US dollar? Well, here's where things get a little more uncomfortable for Uncle Sam. If Bitcoin continues to gain ground, especially as an alternative reserve asset, it might just start chipping away at the power of the dollar. After all, the US is used to being in control. Their ability to print money at will has been a major part of their global power. But if Bitcoin starts being used as an alternative, that control starts to slip away. Suddenly, the US can't just print more money to solve problems. They can't manipulate currency exchange rates as easily. They're no longer in control of the global financial system in the way they used to be. This is a massive shift. And let's be clear, it's not a matter of if this happens, but when. We've already seen the cracks forming. Bitcoin is being adopted by large financial institutions, hedge funds, and even governments. Countries like El Salvador, which officially recognize Bitcoin as legal tender, are showing the world that there's a path forward for crypto. And though it's a small player in the grand scheme of things, their actions are a signal of what's coming next. And make no mistake, the US is paying attention. Now, one of the biggest reasons Bitcoin could become a strategic asset for the US is its ability to hedge against inflation. With the dollar being printed into oblivion and inflation rates rising across the globe, people are starting to panic. Why do you think so many people are flocking to Bitcoin? Because it isn't subject to the same inflationary pressures. You can't print more Bitcoin out of thin air. In fact, it's the complete opposite. Bitcoin's supply is capped at 21 million, making it a deflationary asset. That's why it's being seen as digital gold. Let's take a look at what's happening with traditional assets. The stock market is unpredictable, and don't even get me started on the bond market. The housing market is in a bubble that's waiting to pop. The dollar? Well, it's losing value at a rate that even the Federal Reserve is struggling to control. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is seen by many as a safe haven. It's a hedge against traditional financial systems that are increasingly out of control. And as the US dollar continues to lose its grip on global financial markets, having Bitcoin in their reserves could serve as an insurance policy. It's not just about holding it because it's cool or trendy, although it's definitely both. It's about security and diversification. But let's address the elephant in the room. Bitcoin isn't exactly mainstream just yet. A lot of people still think of it as some get-rich-quick scheme or a speculative asset. Some view it as a volatile, risky investment. Fair enough, but consider this. What if the US government were to lead the way and integrate Bitcoin into its reserves? Suddenly, Bitcoin wouldn't be a get-rich-quick asset anymore. It would be a global financial tool. If the government, the big players in the financial world, and even central banks start taking Bitcoin seriously, the entire perception of it changes. And we already know the US is no stranger to setting global trends. Remember when they decided the internet was going to be a thing? Yeah, that worked out. What about when they made credit a mainstream way to finance everything? Also, a game changer. The US isn't in the business of following trends. They create them. If they were to start holding Bitcoin as part of their national reserves, it would set off a domino effect. The rest of the world would follow, and Bitcoin would go from that weird thing tech geeks are into to that digital asset every serious investor needs in their portfolio. So, why hasn't this happened yet? Well, here's where the politics come into play. The US government is slow to adapt. Let's face it, they can't even agree on who should get health care, let alone whether or not Bitcoin should be classified as a legitimate asset. There's a lot of regulatory uncertainty surrounding Bitcoin, and honestly, the powers that be are still trying to figure out how to even define it. Is it a currency, a commodity, a store of value? The lack of clarity around how to classify Bitcoin has made it difficult for the US government to take definitive action. Plus, let's not forget, there's a lot of people who are scared of Bitcoin. The central banks, traditional financial institutions, and even some politicians are nervous about what Bitcoin represents. It's a direct threat to the existing financial order, and no one likes to see their power challenged. That's why Bitcoin has such a massive target on its back. But as we've seen with every disruptive technology in history, resistance to change only delays the inevitable. In the end, the question isn't whether Bitcoin should be a reserve asset for the US. It's whether the US can afford to ignore it any longer. With more and more institutions adopting Bitcoin, with inflation continuing to rise, and with global uncertainty at an all-time high, Bitcoin is quickly becoming a must-have asset in any strategic reserve. In the next decade, it wouldn't surprise me if Bitcoin is sitting alongside oil, gold, and government bonds in the US national reserves. It's not about replacing the dollar, it's about diversification and securing the future. The world is changing, and the US is no longer the undisputed leader in the financial system. They need to adapt, and they need to do it fast. So let me ask you this. Do you think the US should start holding Bitcoin as a reserve asset? Or do you think the government is just too scared of losing control? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Oh, and by the way, if you liked this video, and if you didn't, well, thanks for watching anyway. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss out on more of my hot takes about the future of finance and tech. Trust me, it's going to get even more interesting from here. See you in the next video. Cheers!